God, we just come before you on this evening, just asking that you would just allow me this evening to share what I believe is to be some very important information. Allow me to be honest, and allow everyone who is here to open up their minds and be receptive to the information. If they're triggered by anything of what's said, that you would appropriately comfort them, and we would ask that everything that is moving forward is just shared in decency and in order. And it's in your Son's name we pray, Jesus Christ, amen. 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 Well, first I have to thank my pastor for allowing me and giving me the opportunity to come here before you this evening and to kind of discuss and to share a lot of what is interesting. Us as the Black community have taken on and embraced as just the norm, and that's trauma. By the time we are finished, and this is going to be a two-part series, today I'm going to be laying the foundation, telling you, describing to you what trauma is, the different types of trauma. Next week, I'm going to be sharing with you and showing you from a biological, physiological perspective of what happens when trauma occurs. The first thing I want you to understand, this is going to be, I'm going way forward, but I'm going to be going back. A lot of times when we see people dealing with trauma, we believe and we think that they are reacting to something and it's in their head. But understand that you're going to learn that when trauma occurs, that person is responding to a physiological sensation in his or her body. We're going to talk about something called the central nervous system and things of that nature, and how when a person is traumatized, something is triggered in their body. What we see is their body reacting. And what happens, which is interesting, and I'm going way forward, when a person is in a traumatic state, what happens is that person's ability to think literally shuts down. It stops. And we're going to explain how that happens physiologically. This person right here, this is Nathaniel Reed. At the age of 42, Nathaniel Reed slit his wrist, hung himself, and committed suicide. He was just 42 years old. Nathaniel Reed was my father. This represents the reason of how and why I got into this industry. Now, I'm going to share some things with you tonight. And like I said, I prayed about sharing this portion, but I wanted to be totally honest so you can understand how I got into this field and the situation that motivated me into this field. My father killed himself. It was December 15th, 1990. I was a senior at college. I had just gotten off of work, and I'd gotten a phone call. My mother, I got a phone call. You know, when you're in college, you don't have a phone in your room. The phones are in the hallway. So I had 4 or 5 people that came up to me and was like, people are calling me back home. Something bad must have happened. At that time, my grandmother was in the hospital, and I automatically assumed that it was her. When I called back home, my mother said, your father, she was crying and she was hysterical. Mother said, your father killed himself. So that experience was literally the thing that changed my life. What you're also going to learn is that when trauma occurs, that the person who experiences the trauma, they are never the same. They're never the same. And it may be subtle, but physiologically and mentally, developmentally, that person is never the same. This changed my life. So to go into more detail in terms of what I wanted to share, regrettably at that time, I didn't get a lot of encouragement and support around how I was supposed to handle my father's death. So, regrettably, my father was what you would call a functional addict. He was working full-time, but he was also selling and using drugs. Now, the caveat is that he was engaged and married to a white female. Now, come to find out, anybody who's ever sold drugs know anything about that. My father was selling drugs, and what he ended up finding out is that he was selling what they call burners. In other words, he was selling something that wasn't what it was supposed to be. The product wasn't pure. Pastor talked about that on Sunday, like just didn't step on it, things like that. So come to find out that my father's fiance was using some of the product and replacing it with ashes. So my father's selling it to people. Now he's on people off his money because they're saying the stuff you gave me wasn't what it was supposed to be. Well, lo and behold, my father and his fiance get into a fight. The police are called. Who do you think they arrested? My father. My father, as you can see, is a dark-skinned man, and he was in a fight with she was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white female. They arrested him. He was in jeopardy of losing his job, everything that he had established, and so in a moment of desperation, he took his life. I actually still have the envelope that the last thing he wrote, which means he was thinking about me when he killed himself. He has 5 kids, and the last thing he wrote was a note to me. And that note said, "I'll make my son Devin Patterson beneficiary of my insurance." And it was almost not legible because as he was writing, at least from the cutting of his wrist, he was getting weak. And the pen, you can see his penmanship was starting to fade. So I was so upset. I needed somebody to blame. I blamed her. So for a long time, I went through this period of my life where I did not like white people. And because my father was now gone, when I was born, my father was over in Vietnam fighting. I was born in 1968. He was over in Vietnam fighting. When he got my mom pregnant, he had come home on a visit, got her pregnant or whatever. And before I went to college, my father said to me, he said, "Son," like I said, he had 5 kids. He said, "You're the best mistake I ever made." So him and I had a very close relationship. So because I was so hurt, I was in the process of doing something that to this day, I share more about it now than I ever have. I'm going to give you guys details of it because it's important to where we're going. I was upset at his fiance. And so my mindset was, I'm going to kill her. Now, this wasn't just a figurative thing. Like I said, my father was a Vietnam veteran. He taught and showed me some things, good things and then some not so good things. So what I did was one day, I had a plan. I knew her routine, and I was on a mission to come back to Pittsburgh to kill her. When I was in school, those of you who went to college, sometimes you had what are called seminar classes. Seminar classes are classes, there may be 100, 200 people in the classroom. A lot of times the professor doesn't know if you attended or not, right? So what I did was I asked a friend of mine, I said, "I need you to sign me in. Go down there and put my name on the sheet. You have to put the last 4 digits of your social. Put that on there so that they think that I arrived." Then what I did was I rented a vehicle, parked it about 5 miles away from the school. We had a bus that left the school. So I parked this vehicle outside, rented the car, parked this vehicle outside the school. Then I had my vehicle, and I parked my vehicle in front of the campus police station. I told them, I said, "Hey, I'm having some car troubles." It was a lie, but this was in my mind, a part of the way that I was going to get away with this. I said, "Hey, I'm having some car trouble. Can I leave my vehicle in front of the police station?" In my mind, I'm thinking, in the event that something happens, I checked into my class, my vehicle was parked in front of the police station, right? So I got up about, I left campus about 9 o'clock in the morning, drove to Pittsburgh. Now, driving from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh only takes 1 tank of gas. I didn't stop, I didn't make no stops. When I had to go to the bathroom, I'd use the bathroom on the side of the road, all right? Also what I did was, at that time, they had a lot of pet boys down in Philadelphia. So I stole a license plate down in Philadelphia, stole a license plate. Then I also got me some spray paint. It was like this temporary tint spray paint. So my plan was to, when I get to Pittsburgh, this is what I did. I got here extremely early. She used to take the dog out walking about 5 a.m., her and the dog Max. So I went out, spray painted the windows with this temporary tint, changed the license plate, parked in front of the house, had my Davis Industry 380 gun on the side. I see her flick on the light. Now I'm waiting. She comes out, her and the dog Max. I start the car up. I know where she's walking. I drive past her. I park, and as you're walking, they live on North St. Clair, and as you're walking, there was an alley that they had to pass. So like I said, I drove past her. It's like a regular car driving past. She didn't notice. Parked, got out my car, slid the chamber, went in the chamber, and I sat and I listened. And since we was walking the dog, you can always hear a dog coming. You hear the little, and she was walking, and I was getting ready to turn, and as I was turning, I believe I heard my father say, "Devin, no." Because I was in so much pain, I was ready to, I went there with the intention of killing her and that dog because I was so much in pain. I blamed her for my father taking his life. That was the most traumatic experience of my life. I didn't go to therapy or anything like that, but I wanted to find out and discover why he did what he did. And that would push me into the field in the profession of mental health. Because I realized he was in a very traumatic state, and this is why he took his life. So I wanted to share that with you, which is more detailed than I probably ever shared, but just so that you kind of know the person who's standing in front of you. Now let's talk about this trauma thing. Oops, wrong way. What is trauma? Trauma results from an event, series of events, or circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has a lasting effect on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So again, trauma is this event that occurs to an individual. Now catch the fact that it says to an individual. Now we're also going to talk about later on, there are times when we can experience what is called either collective trauma or group trauma, cultural trauma, those kind of things. But trauma is experienced by the individual. And what it does is it physically or emotionally harms that person in threatening the individual's functioning, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Categories of trauma. Acute trauma. So acute trauma is a single traumatic event. So that is when the person experiences a one-time thing. It can be a physical assault. It can be a rape, a motor vehicle accident, or a mass shooting. Those are one-time events. And so those are called acute traumatic experiences. Now again, we're going to talk about how the average person is going to experience several traumatic instances in their life. most of us are able to deal with and cope with those relatively easily. So acute trauma is the one that is the most typical, it's the one that occurs the most, but it's the one that people are able to typically get over. Then you have something that's called chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is something that occurs following a series of events, and these events happen multiple times. So, domestic violence. Somebody lives in an abusive home where the husband is beating the wife. That is what's called chronic because it's not a one-time incident. It happens over and over and over and over again. Sexual abuse. That is a chronic traumatic experience. Why? Because it's not the acute, it's not a one-time thing. It happens over and over again. Bullying. So we have kids who go to school, and them going to school is a traumatic experience because they're being bullied and harassed over and over and over again. Medical illnesses, homelessness, neglect, war. We have several wars that are going on globally right now. And even things that we never even think about, starvation and deprivation. People who have food deficiencies and are not able to meet their basic needs, it is a traumatic thing to constantly be worrying about where I'm going to get my next meal from. And how many times have we seen these people and we rush past and we walk past them, not taking the time to think, to live in their shoes for one moment, to think that you woke up today, you didn't have to worry about what you were going to wear, what you were going to eat, any of those things, but they have to go through the chronic traumatic experience of how am I going to eat? And so a lot of times in moments of desperation, they will do what they have to do in order to survive. And one of the things we're going to learn about, and hopefully this is going to change your perception of how you see traumatic responses, one of the things we're going to learn about is that when a person is in a traumatic state and they're being traumatized, their ability to think and rationalize goes out the window. Survival mode takes over. Then you have this. This is what's called complex, and then I have in parentheses, developmental trauma. So this is children being exposed to multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive or interpersonal nature. So that's child abuse, neglect, abandonment, witnessing violence or abuse. Now, the research says this: out of all the traumatic instances that occur, out of everything that happens, the thing that has the most impact in terms of traumatic experiences, the most devastating impact, is what's called interpersonal trauma. Interpersonal trauma is when a person is abused, neglected by a person who's supposed to take care of them and love them. So what you're going to find out is that the complex trauma, or what's called developmental trauma, which is referring to how kids are raised, that has the longest lasting, most devastating impact on an individual. It does. It does. So, I mean, so we do have what are called now these are the different types of trauma. I'm going to kind of fly through these because I'm going to get to where I want to go. So you have natural disasters. So you got hurricanes, fires, and floods. These are types of trauma. So you have people who, we see them on the news. You hear people who lose their homes, there are fires, there are floods. These are traumas. The type of trauma that is what's called a natural disaster. We have human-caused disasters, which is accidents, wars, environmental disasters, acts of terrorism. Now, again, right now, at least in the world, there's been an increase in terrorist activity over the past 20, 30 years. So you have people who are traumatized by that. This one is something that's all too familiar with us: community violence. So this actually is a community tragic community trauma when in our communities there's robberies, shootings, assaults, gang violence, hate crimes. Hate crimes they're going to increase now that we are in the midst of a political season. Last year there were 14,000 hate crimes reported. Okay, about 67% of those were committed against people. About 30% was committed against property, but about 67% of all hate crimes were committed against people, almost 14,000. 51 to 55% of the perpetrators were white. Now, what's also interesting as it relates to hate crimes, we are sitting in the hub of what you would call a hate-filled state. Pennsylvania has the third highest concentration of hate groups in the country. California is number 1, Florida is number 2, and we are tied with Texas at number 3. Now, but here's something that's also interesting. Pennsylvania also leads the country and has the highest rate of hate propaganda in the entire country. So where we are sitting right now in Pennsylvania, you are more likely to see hate rhetoric, anti-Semitism, or racist propaganda in Pennsylvania than anywhere else in the entire country. We rank number 1 in that regard, but we are third in terms of right-wing hate groups and militias and mobs and things of that nature. Now, we don't get to see it a whole lot here, at least where we're at. But when you go out, when you drive outside of Pittsburgh, and you go past that turnpike about 5-10 miles, Confederate flags and "We love Trump." I mean, I've seen whole houses painted "We love Trump." You start to see more of that. So those are things that traumatize people. So hate crimes is something that is definitely on the rise. And it's deep that when it comes to the school violence, and we know this all too well. You know, when I was coming up, and most of you here, we used to have fire drills. We didn't have active shooter trainings. We had fire drills. And truthfully, that was not a day off, but it was like a 20-minute break. I mean, you got the fire drill go off, you get to go outside, but now we have schools that have active shooter drills. Since Columbine, there have been almost 400 mass shootings in the country, affecting 360,000 kids since Columbine. And it's almost, you can almost say that Columbine was one of the first, I mean, it goes back to the 60s and 70s, but that was the first major one. And since then, almost 400 school shootings. So you have kids who are elementary school kids. I know the one time they talked about how, and I don't remember which one it was, I remember they was interviewing a little girl. She was 9 years old. Her classmate had been killed. And she said that she wiped blood on her body and played dead. So imagine you were 9 years old and you are wiping your body with blood because you want to survive. And can you imagine the trauma that these young girls, that these young kids had to face after that experience? Whew. This literally, a lot of the traumatic experiences that people are exposed to, this is the venue or the avenue that it comes from. Family. Family trauma is abuse, neglect, experiencing or witnessing domestic violence, incarceration of family members, family substance abuse, sudden or unexpected loss of a loved one. So as it relates to abuse, every 10 seconds, a child in the United States is abused. Every 10 seconds. Every every 3 hours, a child is killed, dies, typically at the hands of a family member. Every 9 seconds in the United States, a woman is kicked, punched, slapped, drugged by her hair, by her paramour, by her partner, making it that over 3 million children witness domestic violence on a daily basis. So this is the avenue that typically, and the research has shown, the greatest impact of traumatic experiences come when children are abused or neglected by the people who are supposed to take care of them. This is one that's on the rise, obviously with foreigners, so refugee and immigration trauma, so exposure to war, political violence, torture, forced displacement, migration, accelerated stressors, fears of deportation. So imagine you come to this country, to the United States, and you're here, and there's always this constant threat of being deported. I think it was Texas, and correct me if I'm wrong, where now they passed these laws that they are now allowed to, on site, question and pull somebody, question and arrest somebody that they think might be here illegally. It's Texas, thank you. I should have known Texas, right? So again, that's a traumatic experience because you're going out trying to go to work, and now you're being pulled over, you're being questioned, and we all know anybody who is brown and beige and above, your experience with law enforcement is a traumatic experience, and that's something I can speak to. And it's at the age of 55, when I'm driving down the street, if the police are behind me, I don't have anything in my car, I'm not hiding, I'm not doing anything. If the police are behind me, and if they put on their sirens, I become extremely nervous. I do. And that's not because I'm doing anything, but that's because of something we're going to talk about, which is secondary trauma, is because I've seen what has happened to people who look like me when they've had encounters with the police. This one that we're all familiar with, so medical trauma is pain and injury and serious illness and invasive medical procedures. Those things can be very, very traumatic. They can be very traumatic to the people who are experiencing them. Oftentimes, people who have serious medical conditions, at the convenience of trying to not superimpose on their family and friends, they try to hide the fact that they're experiencing these traumatic experiences. Yes. But when you look about people who have terminal illnesses and things of that nature, very high on the scale in terms of suicidality, just in terms of wanting the pain to end. So those things can be very, very, very traumatic. Obviously, this is a huge one. Poverty, lack of resources, support networks, mobility, financial stressors, homelessness. And trust me, not being able to pay a bill, not being able to care for yourself is and can be a traumatic experience. And a lot of times, people in these situations, they have to humble themselves, sometimes to ask for help, and sometimes only to be rejected and to be belittled and to be made to feel less than. That is a traumatic experience. Historical trauma. So this is, and also what you'll sometimes hear with this, I didn't put it up there, but sometimes you'll hear what they refer to as generational trauma. That's the trauma that's referring to potentially the trauma that our ancestors experienced, it being passed down to us. So it's multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific culture, racial or ethnic group. This is a brand new concept. So this one is also called, like I said, generational trauma, or transgenerational trauma, trans meaning the transference of the trauma. It is, if you think about it, our ancestors, in order to survive, they had to learn how to socialize, how to mobilize, and how to engage with law enforcement, the police, because it was a very, very life-threatening situation. And there are times when, lo and behold, you can pass on. Now, people will say things like, well, there is no trauma gene per se. Now here's the word you gotta catch. There's transfer and there's transmission. So trauma can be transmitted to somebody, but it can be transferred. How can it be transferred? So let's assume you are you're standing there with you. I'm standing with my mom. I remember this as a kid, actually. I'm standing with my mom, and there's a back then it was in the 70s. They were in the Dobermans. Everybody had Dobermans back in the 70s. It wasn't pit bulls. Had Dobermans. She didn't have to say anything, but if she squeezed my hand, and I watched her face, that was a transference of trauma. See, trauma a lot of times, and we're going to talk about this, we talked about the children, you don't have to necessarily tell them, but when you're in an environment that is traumatic, when you're in an environment that is hostile, you learn how to survive in that environment. A couple things you learned when you was a kid coming up in the 70s. You learned things like, stay in the kid's place, you be quiet, dad coming home, don't talk to. It's interesting. You think about how we engaged in the 70s. A lot of times the men in the house, they didn't talk to you. They didn't communicate with you. Like that was the norm. They came in, y'all better be quiet, daddy's home. You're quiet, and so what you're learning as a kid, dad comes home, all of a sudden you start getting anxious. Anxious in the stomach, like, man, I better be quiet, man, dad's home. Don't make me come down there. He come down there, everybody nervous. But a lot of the things that we learn, even in terms of how we deal and respond to trauma and the negative events that occur in our life, those things start at a very young age in the home environments that we grew up in. We're going to talk about that next time, when I'm going to show you and talk to you about in the brain, how it affects the brain, the body, what happens, even when something as simple as my mom squeezing my hand, me watching her face. When you think about it, kids a lot of times will look at their parents to look for guidance and what am I supposed to do? When a baby is not even able to communicate, they can walk, and this is the deepest thing, and science has proven this, babies can walk into a room, not walk into a room, they carry into a room. And there's just some people that they get around, I ain't feeling you. Ain't nobody communicating, but that baby, no, partner, don't like me. And they crying. And now this person over here, they love each other, but you go to grab them and they crying. And that is an innate thing that God has given us. But again, even babies at a very young age, they read in the room. They are reading the room. And a lot of how they respond in what you would call stressful situations is based off of what they've learned from a very young age. This one is almost like the historical trauma, racial trauma, which is the potentially traumatic experience resulting from direct experience of racial harassment. We've all experienced these things. Witnessing racial violence towards others and experiencing discrimination in institutions. We understand the language of racial trauma. People who are not African American, or I have a lot of white coworkers, and it is always interesting. Monday morning, after another black boy had been shot, how the conversations go. It's very interesting. It is almost, it's what they call in politics. It's the bipartisan thing. I see an innocent, he ain't gotta be innocent. I see a black man that was killed. Irrespective of what he was doing, he was running away. He was no threat. He was shot in the back. They see Well, what did he do 10 years ago? You know, why was he running? What's his record? And so a lot of times, I remember talking to one of my coworkers, and I said to her, I have to have conversations with my teenage son that you never have to have with your boy. What do you mean? I have to tell him if he ever gets pulled over, not being driving, but if he ever gets stopped by law enforcement, that he is not to resist, he is not to pull away, he is not to run. I mean, I have to sit down and do like this checklist of not to do's. And I have to say to him, listen, you let me fight for you. You just do that and get home. She looked at me like, well, why would you have to have that conversation? There's a reason why, because I don't look like you. My son doesn't look like your son, and he has a target on his back, so he has to have these experiences. So what's the prevalence of trauma? According to the most recent research, 70% of all adults in the USA, that's almost 24 million people, have experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their lives. Now, the beautiful thing about that is that one traumatic event, most of us are able to successfully navigate through that, to get through that. There's a thing that's called your stress response system, and we're going to talk about that next week. Stress response system is basically how your body responds to a traumatic experience. Now, how your body responds to stress in your stress response system is typically based on your tolerance level. There's a thing that's called your core network system, and that holds what's called your tolerance. So all of us in here, you have a tolerance level, a stress level that if it gets to this point, I'm about to go off. As long as it's here, I'm okay. So 70% of all Americans who experience a traumatic event, they'll be okay. They'll navigate through it. 61% and 61% of men, 51% of women report at least one traumatic event in their lifetimes. Now here's a huge one. 20% of people who have a traumatic experience will develop what's called PTSD. We've all heard of PTSD, right? So even PTSD is not, 20% is nothing to sneeze at. However, most people who have a traumatic experience will not end up with a PTSD diagnosis. There's a very specific criteria of things that have to be met for it to be PTSD. But most people, they don't fall into that category, which is a good thing. Now here's one that's interesting. Women are 2 times more likely to develop PTSD than men. 2 times more likely. Well, a couple of reasons. So it's 2 things. Most of the women, statistically, most of the women who do end up developing PTSD, it's typically related to a sexual assault or a sexual crime. Because more women, regrettably, are sexually assaulted than men. And so a lot of times, one traumatic experience does oftentimes trigger or ignite another traumatic experience. So they're kind of overlapping and overlaying. So it was also a hormonal thing. It's also hormonal in terms of testosterone and things of that nature. We're going to talk about that, how and why women are more likely to develop it versus men. 29% of combat veterans will develop PTSD. This here was, so there was something that was called the ACE study. So, and she smiles, she must have heard of it, which is great. So the ACE study is what's called Adverse Childhood Experience. It's an acronym, Adverse Childhood Experience. So this study found a direct link between childhood trauma and the adult onset of chronic disease, incarceration, addiction, mental illness, and unemployment. So this study here right now is the bedrock, because what this study is telling all the researchers in the field is that the higher a person's ACE score is, the more likely they're going to develop a chronic disease, heart disease, diabetes, obesity. This study was phenomenal in that they are now using this as the way insurance companies are tapping into this, because you know anything about insurance companies, they are always trying to predict how long you're going to live, how healthy you're going to be, or what's going to happen to you. This ACE study indicates that people who had higher ACE scores or had more adverse childhood experiences, these people, they were more likely to be smokers, to use intravenous drugs. People with certain, I think it was like people with ACE scores of 5 or above, they at least had a minimum of 30 sexual partners. They began having sex earlier. All of these different things. This study was phenomenal. Now, it's interesting how the study was even found out. The Kaiser Foundation in the 1980s, the original thing was the doctor was doing research on obesity, and he had a successful diet clinic. People were losing 50, 100, 200 pounds. But what he found out is that people who were coming into the study, for some reason, they were dropping out. They would lose weight and then they would drop out. So he started interviewing people like, I'm not understanding why you came here, you were 100, 200 pounds overweight, you lost some weight, and then you started dropping off. So he started going back and he started interviewing the participants. So one of the participants, and this was, you call it serendipity, you can call it whatever, but this mistake is what initiated the ACE study. He asked her, he said, he meant to ask her, how old were you when you first had sex? That was the question that he was asking, and this was a part of the process. He meant to ask her, how old were you? Instead, he said, how much did you weigh when you first had sex? Now, here's the kicker. The female started crying, and she said 40 pounds. Why did she say 40 pounds? She was 4 years old, and it was her father. So now he's saying, okay, wait a minute. Now, keep in mind, this was just one person who said this. The next person he brings, the next female he brings in, you were doing so great. You lost, I think she lost 60-something pounds. Why did you stop coming to the clinic? And she said, because men started whistling at me, they started noticing me. And he said, well, what's the problem in that? She said, listen, when I was overweight, I was invisible. Nobody seen me. She also was the victim of a sexual assault. The next person was a young lady she was 12 years old. Her brother and 6 of his friends grabbed her, tossed her on the dining room table, took turns raping her. She became pregnant, 12 years old. Her mother blamed her and aborted that baby on that same dining room table. These are all things he's finding out. And so what he wanted to find out is all of these people had a common thing, that they had these negative experiences when they were young. And so he developed this thing called the ACE studies. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you guys as part of we call it a homework assignment, but I'm going to give you the I'm gonna give you the ACE test. You can take it on your own. I don't want you to, you don't have to share it with me, but you can kind of see where you score. But 0 to 3 is like low. 4, 5, and 6, you're at risk. You're at risk of potentially developing, as they call it, whether it's a chronic disease, drug addiction. And again, obviously, this doesn't mean this won't apply to you, but if you're just interested in knowing how you score on the ACE, and these are questions that they're asking, things that happened to you before the age of 18, if you can remember. And then with scores of 7 and above, these are the high risk categories of people who are going to in some way experience some of these traumatic instances. So, next thing, 60% of adults report experiencing at least one negative childhood experience. So, all of us in here probably have, when you get your ACE, your ACE test, you're probably going to say, there's probably just one thing on there. You're saying, yeah, that was me. That happened to me before the age of 18. But look at that and kind of see where you fall. Now, don't take it as a kind of doom and gloom kind of thing, but just so that you can kind of get an idea or a picture of where you fall into the category. So, what determines if a person is traumatized? And this is kind of going to be like a segue into next week. This is going to kind of sound like something Pastor Mike has taught us, which is the E plus R equals O. You've heard that before, but this isn't that. And although he was on to something, whether he knew it or not, but this is actually, anybody who does work on trauma, these are there's 3 E's that determine if a person has a traumatic experience. There's 3 E's. The first one is the event, right? So the event, whatever happens, is going to determine if you have a traumatic experience. The next thing is the experience. So the event is one thing, but how the person experiences it is the thing that makes it traumatic, right? Like if right now, let's just say there was a fire here in this building. We all see the fire. We're all running out. The fireman across the street, he's nonchalant about it. He's laissez-faire about it. His experience with this the building falling apart is much different than ours. You know what I mean? We may be traumatized, may be hyped up about it. He's going to be calm. So a lot of what determines whether a situation is traumatic or not is not just the event, but how the person experiences it. 2 people can experience the same exact thing and see the same exact thing. One person is traumatizes, the other person, it has no impact or effect on them whatsoever. It doesn't have anything to do with their mental capacity or anything like that. But a lot of it has to do, we're going to learn, a lot of it has to do with how, when they were young, when they were a baby, how when the stress response system, and all of us have a stress response system, how that thing was cultivated, how you learn how to manage and deal with stress from a very young age. Because babies do have, when they cry, they're stressed out. Why are they stressed out? I'm hungry. Why am I stressed out? I'm cold. I don't just pooped on myself, I'm stressed out. So a lot of how you respond to a stressful situation goes back to our childhood. And the final thing is the effects. So what determines how a person is, if a person is traumatized, the event happens, the experience, which is like the hub of it, just like how Pastor talked is, event plus response equals outcome. The response is the major part of that. The event is gonna happen. The response being in the middle, that's the most important part because it determines the outcome. And just to hear event, experience, and effects. Now again, like I said, Pastor was on to something because this is actually, you're doing the research on trauma, they'll tell you when they're trying to figure out and they're categorizing the traumatic event, this is the formula that they use to determine that, the event and how that person experienced it. How was that experience for them? Okay, questions? I'm kind of went through. I'm not kind of quick, but any questions? No.
Pretty self-explanatory.
So next week we're going to spend time really talking about explain how when the event happens, just what goes on in the body, in the mind, how people respond certain ways, how long. Now here's an interesting fact. Now this is deep. Let's just say you go out here and you get into an argument with somebody. Let's say they're a relative or a friend or something like that there. When that thing hits your body, like you're in the midst of it, your heart's beating fast, your blood's flowing through your brain, those kind of things, right? Do you know that you have adrenaline? In order for your body to be fully functional, it has to be at an equilibrium, it has to be in a calm state. It literally takes your body 15 to 30 hours to process that traumatic experience. So anything that happens to our body, so when it happens, the trauma does enter your body. And your body is doing something it has to process that trauma. And so it takes the body 15 to 30 hours to process that trauma. But imagine a person who has a traumatic experience. You have one in the morning, and then before you get home from work, you have another one. Now, mind you, your body has not metabolized the first traumatic experience, so you still on high, and there's certain things that are happening inside of your body that causes people to respond in a certain way. It's like a cocktail, and we keep pouring these cocktails in there. Remember I talked about our tolerance levels? So you a young buck on the street or whatever the case may be, and you are constantly getting knuckles on the swivel. Stuff is happening all around you, and before you can calm down, something else happens, something else happens, something else happens, something else happens. And what happens is because the body's designed the way that it was, it goes into this, and we're going to talk about this next week, this flight or fight response mode, and it goes into high alert. But if you haven't had time to calm down and your body's always on high alert, that does a whole lot in terms of the endorphins, and this pumping morphine into your body, because guess what? When a person, anybody who knows anything about morphine, when you have morphine, guess what? You don't feel no pain. So imagine a young buck who is constantly knuckles on the swivel. He's in survival mode. Now, he don't know that his body's pumping adrenaline, it's being transferred into morphine. He ain't feeling no pain. That also means his ability to think and rationalize is going down. And I'm gonna connect, and when you hear it, it's like, wait a minute, that's the reason why. So guess what? So now this young boy is in class. He done been up all night. All he's thinking about is how I'm going to survive. And what's the first thing we always say to somebody? What is wrong with you? If you don't remember anything else tonight, the question should no longer be, what's wrong with you? The question should be, what happened to you? Right. Makes the world a difference. When I talked about the little kids who get exposed to domestic violence and things like that, they done just been up. Their mom is in the ER. Mom and dad been fighting since 2, 3 in the morning. Now he's in school. The teacher's saying, he's inattentive and he's nodding off in class and she's nudging him. And he got a problem. He's not disciplined enough. Now they want to dope him up in order to calm him down and do something to make him pay attention. Meanwhile, this kid is sitting here. His stress response system is on high because he's nervous thinking about what's happened to my mom. That's all he can think about. And you asking him 2 + 2, I ain't thinking about 2 + 2. Not thinking about it. Two things that can never happen. One thing is when the body is calm. So research now is, and I'm almost like, I don't want to say talking myself out of business, but as it relates to even trauma, therapy is not the most effective thing. One of the most effective things is going to see Camille. This is what I can guarantee you.
Work it out.
Well, it's somewhat, yes, but understand this. You cannot be angry. You cannot be upset when your body's calm. Try it. I'm talking. You can, if your body's calm, you cannot be angry. You cannot be aggressive if your body's calm. And we've got glimpses of that because when the traumatic thing happens, the first thing they say is, take a deep breath, calm down. But now a lot of times you ain't trying to hear that. But lo and behold, when the body is calm, there are certain things that it cannot do. Can't do. Now, here's the other thing. When the body is being, I'm giving them part of my juice now. When the body is in a hyperarousal state, let's imagine you are, how many people in here have ever been on a roller coaster? Been on a roller coaster, right? You're on a roller coaster, right? If you like me, you used to like the racers and the Thunderbolt, things like that there. So imagine you sitting there, I'm in the seat behind you, you're on a roller coaster ride. We're going up, we're getting ready to go down. If I was to ask you, what are your plans for your retirement? Would you be able to answer that question? Why not? Because I'm going to show you, here's what happens. When a person is stressed out, when a person is in a stressful situation, the part of their brain to think and to answer logical questions, they're not accessing that part of their brain. You don't have access to that part of your brain. You just don't. You do not have access to that part of your brain. Person sitting there hanging on the cliff for dear life. You asking him to check out the scenery. Listen, he's trying to hang on for dear life. He doesn't have access to that part of his brain. And so when a traumatic situation occurs, when a person feels threatened, when a person feels in danger, we are operating on an entirely different part of our brain. And it explains why people do what they do, and it's not because they're illiterate, it is because they're not thinking, but guess what? In that situation, they can't think. It's impossible. And we're asking them, what were you thinking? I wasn't thinking. You can't think. And when I show this to you, you're gonna be like, wow, that was me. And situation happened, the last thing that you were able to do was to think. Because you're operating, the central system, your nervous system is operating on something entirely different. And you can't do certain things in certain mindsets. All right? All right. Questions? Any questions? You had I seen your hand go up like, when I first started, your hand went up in the air. Go ahead. Say it again. Neglect. Great question. So neglect is basically, in short, is not taking care of something. So if a child is not fed, is not clothed, he or she is actually being neglected. If the environment is not being clean or whatever, child not being taken care of, not being fed, being neglected. And it's interesting. Do you know that if a child, I think I'm close, but I think if a child is not physically touched every 8 or 12 hours, what begins to happen, that it can be detrimental to the development, because what's happening is that they need, and children do need, the touch of a person, of a human, in order to properly develop. And if it doesn't happen within 8 or 12 hours, it begins to have a negative impact on their thinking and on their feeling and on their stress response system. And this is deep, but we talk about that next week. It's going to be deep. Yes, ma'am. Now again, when I'm saying traumatized, not just experiencing a trauma, when you're in a stressful state, one thing they cannot do is make what you would call rational decisions, because and we're going to talk about it, when the stressful situation happens, there are four ways that we can respond. And the fight one, if a person is in the mode of fighting, what they cannot do is to make what you would call intelligent, logical decisions. They're operating on another side of the brain. The side of our brain that makes up our logic decisions is the left side of our brain. And when you are in a traumatic situation, you're operating out of using your five senses, your brain stem. And we're going to talk about that. So your brain stem is it's your five senses. Think about it, when a baby is young, they can't communicate and say to you, I'm hungry, but they know how to cry. And that's all they have is their five senses. And so when we are in a traumatic situation, we resort back to, when trauma comes and goes from here up, this being our brain. When it comes in through our brain stem, it's our five senses. That's how all trauma comes in. And we know what our five senses are, right? See, sight, smell, taste, whatever. That's how all trauma comes in. And in that situation, your body is trying to interpret what this means. Now, the interesting part is, if in the midst of the situation, you have a quick response, your body doesn't have time to think about it. It's when you see that Vietnam veteran, that war veteran, they're in the midst of a fight. They can't do a whole lot of thinking. When they're fighting, they're not thinking. They've trained for it. They're almost on autopilot because they've been trained to do so. I remember my father telling me there was he was in Vietnam, they threw a grenade into the tent. Two dudes inside the tent beside him, blown away. He got the blood and guts on his helmet, but guess what? He couldn't sit there and rationalize and think about it and say, oh my God, I'm gonna miss you. He had to go into fight mode. Right at that moment, he was not able to think, but he was able to fight. And when a traumatic situation occurs, whether we respond by fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and I'm going to explain what all of those are. The fight is us trying to numb, right? Flight is running away. Freezing is you'll see people who something will happen and they'll just be stuck. What happens is that their five senses have shut down the ability to send signals to the brain. Proven medical fact. Nothing can be sent up to the brain because the body's saying protect, survive, do something. Or the fawn thing. We're going to get into all of that. So, anything else? Good question. So here is Bounce. Can you print this out for me, please? Now this is only 10 questions, but it will give you your ACE score. Now again, don't take this as, oh my God, I'm gonna get a chronic disease, or I'm gonna get diabetes, or have a heart attack. There's nothing like that. But these are the questions that they use. If you remember, 0 to 3, you're kind of at the low risk. 4 to 6 is moderate. 7 and above, you have what they call a high ACE scores. And you better not be applying for no insurance, because they're gonna be like, yeah, we need to talk. But yeah, we need to talk about this.
Do you want this now, or we?
Oh no, that's fine. I don't even want it. You keep that. That's just for you. I don't want to see it. No. I don't. Yeah, I don't even want to see that. That's just for your own personal. Just so you can kind of see where you fell. That's it. Oh, okay. So 0 to 3 is low risk. 4 to 6, moderate. And so anything above 6, which is 7 to 10, is high risk.
See, did you live with anyone who is a problem drinker or alcoholic or use street drugs? Well, yeah, me.
Well, this is adverse child. Yeah, this was you from the age of, before the age of 18, so this is about your parents and who you live with and things like that.
No, you for yourself.
Yeah, I don't want that, no. Oh, wow. Oh, yeah, yeah. That's what,